Today we'll look at Chapter 19, the reproductive system. We will start with the male. So let's take a look at the path of sperm and what structures does the sperm pass through and what glands contribute to the total volume of semen. So, oops. All right, I'll say them first and then we'll look at a picture to make it a little easier. Seminiferous tubules of the testes. So the male gonad or gonad is the testes, whereas the female gonad are the ovaries. So they produce sex cells as well as sex hormones. All right. So from the testes, or within the testes, there are small tubules. And it's within those tubules that meiosis, the process of cell division and production of sperm, occurs. Then from there, it will pass through a structure called the epididymis, then the ductus deferens, the ejaculatory duct, the urethra, and since the urethra is pretty long, it's divided up into three parts: the prostatic urethra, the membranous urethra, and the spongy urethra. All right, and so that is the path of sperm. I did not find. So there's another part to this question, which I did not have in this version. So what structures are found in what's called the spermatic cord? I'm going to add that question in here. And that's the ductus deferens, the testicular artery and vein, the testicular nerve, as well as lymphatic vessels. And then lastly, what are the glands that contribute actually the majority of the volume of the semen to the majority of the volume of the semen is because of these glands: the seminovesicles, the prostate gland, the bulbourethral gland. All right, so let's take a peek and look at the anatomy. All right. Oh, why do I have this question twice? Okay, so let me make it a little bigger here. You can see what we're doing. All right. I want to make it a little bigger. All right, so here are the testes. There's a pair of them. We're just looking at one testis, singular, testes, plural. Within this structure, we have small tubules called the seminiferous tubules. So let's take a look at the next question. Actually, it asks about the testes, and the actual place of sperm production. And this involves what we call the seminiferous tubules. So the seminiferous tubules are tiny tubes where the process of cell division called meiosis occurs. Oops. And let me grab the picture. All right, so here's the testis. And as we see, it's made up of these tiny tubules. These are called the seminiferous tubules. And like I mentioned, sperm is produced in them. Let's go back to this picture. From here, sperm then is transported to this structure here called the epididymis. We see the term epi. Epi means on top of or above. So it sits on top of the testes. And this is the epididymis here. This is a place of not only storage of sperm, but also maturation. So sperm, it's kind of like sperm school. So sperm mature and develop the ability to fertilize an egg should they encounter an egg. From here, sperm will make their way out the ductus deferens. Another name for the ductus deferens is the vas deferens, right? So if you have a vasectomy, right, they're going to cut and tie off that ductus deferens, the vas deferens, and thus prevent sperm from exiting. Now, does that change the volume of the semen? Very slightly, because the majority of the semen, the volume comes from these accessory glands that feed into this tube here. So as sperm leave the testes and travel along the ductus deferens, interestingly, it will come back into the body cavity. So here, I forgot to mention that the testes reside within this pouch called the scrotum. And temperature regulation is very important to proper sperm production. So the body cavity, the temperature within the body is too warm for proper sperm production. So hence the testes and the sperm production occurs outside of the body cavity in the scrotum. And we know temperature is important for that process because, on a cold day, the testes are held closer to the body, and on a hot day or when you've been exercising or something, the testes are held farther from the body. And so regulating temperature to get that optimal temperature for sperm production. Sperm production is called spermatogenesis. Okay, so spermatogenesis, I put that here. That's part of the next question. What is this process called? All right. So sperm then will be transported, if you don't have a vasectomy, okay, back into the body cavity where it will join with a duct called the ejaculatory duct, which is located right there. Okay. From there, sperm will enter the urethra. And I know this is the urethra because here's the urinary bladder up here. And then the urethra will bring urine through the penis and out through the urethra. Okay, so sperm also exits through the urethra, and there are valves that open and close to prevent, sperm or urine from, getting mixed up. So sperm will enter, and because the urethra is so long, they have to section it into different areas. So this gland is a large gland that produces a lot of the secretions in the semen. So this part of the urethra, as it passes through the prostate gland, is called the prostatic urethra. And yes, this is the prostate gland. Okay? So we have the prostatic urethra. We have the membranous urethra as it kind of comes through the floor of the pelvic cavity. And then as it enters the penis, it will be called the penile or spongy urethra. Okay, but it's all urethra and it all transports either urine or sperm. Okay. The other two glands that contribute volume to the semen are the paired seminal vesicles. We only see one seminal vesicle here, but there's another one that comes in from the other side. And that will dump its secretion also into the urethra. The third paired gland is called the bulbourethral gland, sometimes called the Cowper's gland. And so the bulbourethral gland also secretes its secretions into the urethra to contribute the majority of the volume of the semen. And in fact, sperm take up, 1 to 3% of the volume of the semen. So when you get a vasectomy and you prevent the sperm from exiting, you don't really notice too much because it's only 1% of the volume. So you still maintain those secretions and that volume to the semen. in the penis here, we have what's called erectile tissue. There's these columns of erectile tissue that can get filled with blood and allow for the penis to become erect. All right. And so there's different names for it. This is called the corpus cavernosum, and then there's the corpus spongiosum around the urethra. So sometimes this part of the urethra is called the spongy urethra because the corpus spongiosum, this erectile tissue, is right around it. All right. A couple other interesting things is, when you have prostate problems, because the urethra passes right through the center of the prostate gland, if you have prostate cancer or an enlarged prostate, one of the things you're going to notice is a change in urination, right? So as it's enlarging or it becomes cancerous, and it will start to block urine from exiting the urinary bladder. All right, let's move on. Sperm produced in the seminiferous tubules within the testes. This process is called spermatogenesis. And hormones that are produced are called androgens, the main hormone being testosterone. All right, testosterone helps with sperm production as well as the formation of those secondary sexual characteristics that are associated with, puberty in males. Let's move on to the female. So the female, let's go over her anatomy first. Okay. Maybe I'll draw the female one. The male is difficult to draw, but the female is a little easier to draw. So let's go ahead and draw that. Then we'll go back and discuss it. So in the female, we have the female gonad, which is the ovary. And they are paired, right? So there's two ovaries. I'll do one at a time. And the ovaries produce eggs, ova, and once a month, these ova will make their way into the next structure called the fimbriae. So these are little finger-like projections into which the little egg will pass from the ovary into the next structure. This process is called ovulation. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. We talked about the menstrual cycle. So we're just kind of going through the structures. So from here, we have these tube-like structures called the uterine tube, or the oviduct, or the fallopian tube, right, which will transport that little egg along. From here, then, it will encounter the next structure called the uterus. Okay, so we have our ovaries here. And the ovaries are actually held onto the uterus by little ligaments called ovarian ligaments. Okay, so I'm going to take a look on the inside here of the uterus. There is a region, a muscular ring around the lowermost portion of that uterus. So this is the uterus. Okay. And then this kind of lower portion of the uterus is called the cervix. And the cervix is made up of a muscular, smooth muscle ring around it here. So this is smooth muscle here, located in that opening. And then extending from the uterus and the cervix, we have the tube called the vagina. And this is the place in which the erect penis will be inserted to deposit the sperm in here. Now, within the uterus, we have a buildup of tissue throughout the month of a female here called the endometrium. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. The uterus is actually just a giant muscle. It's smooth muscle. All right, and so sometimes we'll call this part, the muscly part, called the myometrium. Myo means muscle, and endo is within. So within the myometrium, within the uterus, we have the lining called the endometrium, and it's the lining that is shed monthly. Right? Now, kind of enclosing all these structures, we have a big ligament here that anchors it to the wall of the abdominal the pelvic cavity. So this is called the broad ligament. Okay, so this is also an ovary. All right, so this is the female reproductive structures. Let's go ahead and go back. Okay, and talk about each one of these things. The ovaries produce the sex cells called oocytes. Oo refers to egg. So these are egg cells, right? And sex hormones. The sex hormones that are produced are called estrogen and progesterone. We'll talk about their role in the menstrual cycle. The uterine tube, also called the fallopian tube, it acts as a transport pathway from the ovary to the uterus. Fertilization occurs there. So if there is a sperm present in the upper part of the uterine tube, then fertilization will take place. Okay. The fimbriae are the finger-like projections on the proximal end that kind of, they don't actually grab the egg, but it's more like vacuumed up into it. The uterus, of course, houses developing fetus. So as fertilization occurs, the fertilized egg called the zygote will begin to divide and then make its way into the uterine, the middle of the uterus, and then implant in the wall that endometrium and the myometrium. Okay. Smooth muscle, myometrium, endometrium lining shed during menstruation, and cervix is the lowermost portion. And of course, the vagina is for the fetal exit or receiving the penis during intercourse. All right, and what is the process of egg production? These are called, the eggs are called oocytes, and depending on different stages of development, we can get primary oocytes, secondary oocytes, etc. And the process of making eggs is oogenesis. Now, interestingly, females, this process of making the eggs, called meiosis, again, is complete. I'm not complete, but it occurs before birth. So females are born with all their eggs. And certain times, starting with puberty, these eggs that are already there begin or continue their meiosis. Okay, so you don't start new, meiotic processes at that time. Okay, that's different from males. Males begin producing sperm through spermatogenesis through the process of meiosis, and it begins at puberty, and it continues throughout their life. Whereas females, again, are done when they're born. And so that's why, having children, getting pregnant, there is a time, a clock ticking in females, biological clock, they call it, because the eggs just kind of get older and there can be more genetic problems because of time, right? Whereas males are continuously producing sperm throughout their life. All right. What hormones do the ovaries produce? Estrogen and progesterone. Okay. So let me put a couple pictures here to go with the female. So here's one that's kind of similar as far as the view, a mid-sagittal section. Oops. In the female, let's see if we can make this larger also. So I showed you a different view. Okay. So again, a mid-sagittal section. We have the ovary here, but there's another ovary, that's been removed, right, from the other side. So here's the ovary. Here's the little fimbriae. All right, here's the uterine tube to the uterus. Okay, here's the myometrium. The endometrium is that inner lining. The lowermost part is the cervix. Now, notice how it's tilted. Okay, there's like an anterior tilt to that uterus, and here's the cervix. So when you are going to give birth, it's the cervix that has to dilate or open up. It has to relax because it's a muscle, smooth muscle, right? So it's the cervix that has to open up to 10 centimeters before you begin pushing. So this is it right here. And then, just beyond that is the vagina. And I want you to notice its proximity to the urinary system and the digestive system. Okay, so whereas in males, when we look at this picture, the urinary system, here's the urinary bladder, and the reproductive system share the urethra. In females, it's a completely separate, different system. Okay, they don't share structures. So in the female, yes, there's a urinary bladder and a urethra. That is the most anterior opening. All right, so here's the pelvic, the pubic symphysis. Okay, the most anterior structure is the urinary bladder in males and females. All right, then posterior to that would be the reproductive system. And then posterior to that, you have the digestive with the anus here. So, when we talked about urinary tract infections, the urethra here is in close proximity to the anus here. So that's why, in females, like especially when you're changing a diaper and, wiping the feces off the baby, right? You always wipe from front to back. You never go from back to front because you're introducing all that bacteria from the feces into the urethra. And that's how you can get urinary tract infections. So, and also just as a female, to remember to wipe front to back and never go the other way because, again, you don't want to introduce bacteria into the urethra. All right. So, let me get one more picture. I know I drew it, but this is more of the orientation that I drew, which is like that. Okay, so we can see much better that broad ligament. Oops. All right, so here's that broad ligament. There is an ovarian ligament attaching it to the uterus. We can see the myometrium, the endometrium inside. All right, vagina and the cervix down here. Okay. Lastly, okay, let's talk about the cyclical menstrual cycle. Okay, so menstruation. So every month, starting at about the age of maybe 13, 12. It's getting earlier and earlier, 11, 12 years old. Females will begin their menstrual cycles. And it will last until what we call menopause, when females stop having their periods, right? And that can be from, in the 40s to 50s. All right. So let's go ahead. And I think I'm going to draw this. Okay, I am going to draw this. Let's go ahead and okay, so I'm going to take a closer look at the ovary and draw a picture of the ovary. So every month, a menstruating female will begin developing or continuing that meiosis process, that development of eggs, and it happens a few at a time. So within the ovary, we have structures called follicles. And within the follicle is the developing oocyte, the egg. I'm just going to call it an egg. All right. So the egg begins developing, and really at the beginning of each cycle, you'll have a few that begin developing, but eventually there'll be one that kind of takes over and becomes the dominant follicle. Okay. And that follicle will develop and grow, and eventually will release that egg through the process of ovulation. Okay. And here's a little egg. So maybe I should label it. So here's our follicles. And then within it is the egg. I'm just going to call it the egg, okay? But oocyte is the proper term. Now, is that the end of this follicle? Well, no, actually, once it loses the egg, it becomes a different structure called the corpus luteum. And if I had a yellow pen, I would draw it yellow, but I don't have one with me. But this becomes a structure called the corpus luteum, which means yellow body because it looks kind of yellowish. Right? So after losing the egg, the follicle becomes a structure called the corpus luteum. And then eventually it degenerates and then goes away. And then we start another cycle in the ovary. So this is the ovarian cycle. And what happens through the month, right? So a cycle, menstrual cycle, is typically a 28-day cycle, about a month. And it begins with actually having your period. So that's when you actually start counting. After you have your period, then follicles begin developing. And then ovulation happens in the middle. And ovulation occurs about day 14. So right in the middle. Okay, you release the egg. So there's stuff happening before ovulation and then stuff happening after ovulation. So let's first talk about some of the hormones that are important. Okay, so I'm going to turn this over and we're going to list, and I've mentioned them already. So hormones involved. First, we have the hormones that are called gonadotropic. Hormones. So these are not secreted by the reproductive structures, but they're secreted by the pituitary gland, in fact, the anterior pituitary gland, and they act on the gonad. So gonadotropic means gonad acting. And there are two that are important. The first one is FSH. Now, we did mention that before, but we didn't really talk a lot about what it did. This is follicle stimulating hormone. So I had to tell you what a follicle was first before you really can understand what that hormone does. Okay, so we have a hormone secreted by the anterior pituitary gland that will act on the ovary, causing some follicles to be stimulated. The other gonadotropic hormone is LH, or luteinizing hormone. Okay, so luteinizing hormone, it helps to maintain, it does several things actually. It can help with the corpus luteum, hence the name luteinizing hormone. So it helps maintain the corpus luteum and actually can stimulate ovulation. Right? So right before ovulation, you kind of have a surge of LH that will cause ovulation to happen. So there, you can do take tests for ovulation, and so there'll be a little rise of LH right before you ovulate. So it's one way to say, call your spouse and say, "Hey, come home. I'm ovulating. All right, come home on your lunch break, or whatever." But anyway, there's a little bit of a rise of in LH. So follicle stimulating hormone, it stimulates a follicle. The other type of hormone, or the sex hormones, and I've already mentioned those, but we'll talk a little bit about them. Estrogen and progesterone. These hormones do several things. They help to maintain the endometrium. Okay. So when you have higher levels of estrogen and progesterone, the endometrium stays put. So I hope you could think about like, all right, so if your levels go down, that must mean you would lose your endometrium, meaning you'd have your period. All right. But on the other hand, during pregnancy, you don't want to lose your endometrium. You want to keep that there. So it must mean that estrogen and progesterone levels are higher. Okay. But there's something that happens with estrogen and progesterone. High levels inhibit the release of FSH and LH. Okay, so when you have a lot of estrogen and progesterone, it's going to prevent more follicles from being stimulated, and um, and then make that corpus luteum go away. Okay, because remember the LH maintains the corpus luteum. All right, so I should put this here, stimulates follicles. Maybe I'll put that up here. Okay, you can put it underneath here as its function. So let me now kind of draw this out. So we kind of have the players, the important things that are listed here. Okay, so now let's see what that looks like. And we're going to start the story out in the brain, all right, with the pituitary gland, the anterior pituitary gland. So here we have our pituitary gland, and it's going to here. it's going to secrete our FSH and our LH. Okay, it's going to be transported in through the blood and then go to the ovary. So here I'm going to make a giant ovary. And so the FSH is going to come in and stimulate the ovary, stimulate the follicles, sorry. Okay, and so this follicle will be stimulated and eventually cause, with a little surge of LH, it's going to cause ovulation. So that little egg's going to go pop, all right, and make its way into the embryo and then into the uterine tube, where it will travel to the uterus. All right, so now let's talk about when we're not pregnant. Okay, so this egg comes here, and if there's no sperm present, it will make its way down and drop into the uterus. The follicle now will become the corpus luteum, and it's the corpus luteum that's going to secrete estrogen and progesterone. Okay, so the corpus luteum here secretes estrogen and progesterone. So I think before I said the ovaries make estrogen and progesterone. Well, yes, but it's actually the corpus luteum within the ovary, right? So this is an ovary. Now, look back. What does estrogen and progesterone do? One of the things they do is to keep the endometrium nice and thick. It's going to maintain the endometrium. Okay. Nice. So again, this is when we're not pregnant. So we secrete estrogen and progesterone. Yeah, our endometrium builds up, tissue builds up, gets nice and warm, ready for a little embryo, if it's possible. Okay. But what else happens here? Estrogen and progesterone act on the anterior pituitary gland to inhibit. So it inhibits the release of FSH and LH. So let's look at what happens then in a cycle, right? Boom, this happens, we ovulate, no pregnancy, the follicle becomes a corpus luteum, which makes estrogen and progesterone, which builds up the endometrium, but then it turns around and turns everything off, okay? If we don't have FSH and LH, okay, remember LH maintained the corpus luteum. So if you turn that off, the corpus luteum goes away, estrogen and progesterone go down, we no longer maintain the endometrium, and we shed it, and you have your period. Okay, so what first went to build up the endometrium, then it turns itself off here, and we shed it, and that would be, the cycle, right? So it's a cycle. All right. And then every month, so once the endometrium is shed, estrogen and progesterone go down, then we no longer inhibit the pituitary gland. And so we get FSH and LH being secreted again, which begins the next cycle. We get more follicles going, we cause ovulation and then maintain the corpus luteum. And then estrogen, progesterone secreted, which builds that up, but then it turns it off again and it's shed, and then everything starts over again. All right, so that is the menstrual cycle, or the cycle of a non-pregnant female. All right, so let's take a look at what happens during pregnancy. So if pregnant, Then the little egg is going to meet a sperm, right? So they say hi, and we form a fertilized egg. A fertilized egg is called a zygote. Okay, and the next chapter talks a little bit about development. So the zygote actually will begin to divide and divide and divide and divide and make a ball of cells and eventually a hollow ball of cells that's going to implant in the wall here. You're going to form a little placenta here with the uterus, okay? And but the question is, so we go through this process, ovulation, that happens to get fertilized, but that follicle becomes a corpus luteum. We make estrogen, progesterone. How do we prevent it from being turned off? Because this happens also. Estrogen and progesterone is going to turn off luteinizing hormone, which will get rid of the corpus luteum. So we have to have some way of maintaining the corpus luteum independent of this loop here. And we do. So what happens is the placenta produces a hormone called HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin. Long word. Human chorionic gonadotropin. Okay. And what this does is it works independently to maintain the corpus luteum so it can keep estrogen and progesterone high and keep the endometrium there. So in pregnancy tests, when you take a pregnancy test, you test for this hormone in your urine. And some people say, well, it's kind of positive, but can there be a false positive? Well, not really, because the only time you produce HCG is when you have a placenta, okay, when you're pregnant. So if you're pregnant, if it shows up any kind of positive, you are pregnant. All right. So we're maintaining the corpus luteum, okay, but and the estrogen and progesterone stays high to maintain the endometrium. But this is turning this off. So while you're pregnant, you don't stimulate new follicles and you don't ovulate, okay, because these are turned off. All right. So with that knowledge, now how does birth control work? So let's say the pill, okay, and there's lots of variations on that, whether it be injections or, things you implant, whatever. It deals with hormones. Okay, so, but now let's think about it. So you're taking the pill. Okay, what are you taking? You're taking estrogen and progesterone, varying, formulations. There's different formulations you can have. And I think there are also progesterone only pills too. So there's lots of different variations, but the idea is that you take hormones. So by taking hormones, what are you doing? You maintain the endometrium, sure, and you don't have a period, but you're preventing follicles from being stimulated and ovulation from happening. Okay, because remember, estrogen and progesterone is going to turn these things off. So that's how it works to prevent pregnancy. Okay, now at the end of the pills, there's a week of the white pills. What is in those white pills? Because when you take the white pills, the last pills of your packet, you have your period, right? So what's in there? Ah, there's no hormones in there, no estrogen and progesterone. So if you don't have estrogen and progesterone, what do? You have your period. Okay. And it's to create that, that habit of taking a pill every day. I had a someone I know who would skip the white pills and never have her period. Okay, but I don't know if that's good or bad. I haven't looked up studies or whatever. But anyway, it makes sense, to understand how this works. All right, let me go and put something in. Let's go back to our study guide and fill that in here. Now, describing the ovarian cycle, uterine cycle. So remember, the ovarian cycle would be what's happening in the ovary. Okay. These are the hormones, right? And so let's bring up this one. Would really answer that. Right, so this one is showing you what's happening in these different areas. So here's what's happening in the pituitary gland. Here's what's happening in the ovary. Okay, so I drew it a little differently, right? I actually drew an ovary, but we see some follicles that are developing. We get ovulation, and then we get the formation of the corpus luteum, right? So that is the ovarian cycle. Then we have the uterine cycle. What's happening with the uterus? And this bottom one is what's happening there. So, and then we have the hormone levels here. LH and FSH here. And then, and you could see a big surge of LH right before ovulation. Then we have estrogen and progesterone and what happens there. All right, and then we look at the lining of the uterus. Here's the endometrium. And we can see, we start counting day 1 at the beginning of your period. And then the endometrium builds up. Okay, it builds up as estrogen and progesterone is secreted, and then it's shed again. Okay, so this represents the ovarian, uterine, as well as the hormonal levels throughout the cycle. And I do have a little picture of what I just kind of drew. If you want to include this, you don't have to, but all right. Okay, I hope that made sense. Okay, it's complicated, and hopefully each time you look at it, it will make a little bit more sense. And so there we go. Here I did use yellow because it's called the yellow body, the corpus luteum. Okay, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.